Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Blood, Dust and Snow, Chapter 6. July the 5th, 1941. I am livid with anger. Yesterday, the divisional command post alerted us that there were about 20 enemy tanks and masses of Russian infantry reported in the forest of Baltinava. We were now supposed to do some tidying up. After 40 kilometers on dusty roads, we arrived there only to find that Lieutenant Lög of the 3rd Company of Flak Battalion No. 3 has already destroyed 12 of them with his gun and finished off another 6 with hand grenades during a combat patrol. 6 tanks had escaped, and we were now supposed to take them out on the way back from our glorious special operation. I was lucky enough to be in the lead position, and what happens? It is slowly getting dark, and even though I can still see through the binoculars, I can't see anything through the optics, and most of the 20 shells I fired on 2 Russian tanks, which had suddenly appeared ahead, missed. One was a Polski tank, the other a funny machine gun tank with 2 turrets. The crews had bailed out and fled, but I could not prove that any of my shots had hit. A very bad end to a day which had started in quite a promising manner with the destruction of some Russian lorries. But one thing at a time, as it all started with the march to Villani. In the morning at about 0300, after waking up, the routes which would lead us deeper into Russia were announced by the boss. We had always wondered why the Russians never blew up any bridges when even a piss-filled ditch would have stalled us for hours. And now, at Villani, for the first time, the bridge had disappeared and our whole advance ground to a halt. On that morning I was not lead platoon but arrived late, which meant that I could only follow what went on ahead via the radio. A group of motorcyclists of the regimental staff of Schützen 114 had driven right into a line of Russians, and our lead tanks were now on the way to bail the lads out. When the Russians then retreated towards the left, towards the destroyed bridge, we had already resumed our advance in a west-east direction, trying to get to the next village in a roundabout way. I, Giersig, Schirmer and Wichler, who had only caught up with us later due to a technical breakdown, now formed the tip of our advance to Villani. It was raining heavily. The rest of the marching group was only to follow us if the bridges at Ustrono and Vemurani were still intact. My platoon had been tasked to reconnoiter. To assist us, we had been assigned a pioneer lieutenant and a group of riflemen under Lieutenant Jung. It all went okay until we arrived in front of Villani, where suddenly there was firing going on. Again, it was impossible to see who was firing upon whom. Giersig drove in front of me and the rain was pouring down. It was hardly possible to identify a target through the optics, and even less so through the binoculars, which were immediately sprayed with rain. A few Russians were making a run from a house ahead on our left when Giersig suddenly opened fire on the crossroads 400 meters in front of us. He had spotted an enemy anti-tank gun, which I would not have spotted with the best will in the world, even though I was right behind him. When the shooting in front died down a little, we drove forward, and when we arrived at the crossroads, the first elements of our march group arrived behind us. I shared Giersig's joy at this well-aimed shot, which had damaged the armored shield and the sight of the anti-tank gun just at the moment when it had been moved into a position to engage us. Together with Oberleutnant Feige's riflemen, we drove further through the town before turning right into the advance road which would take the 6th Panzer Division to Trikani. When exiting the town, we halted to allow the rest of our Kampfgruppe to catch up, as ahead of us the Russians, with a strong motorized force, were withdrawing under the protection of some armored reconnaissance cars. From where we stood at the town's exit, we could see one of them observing us from the reverse slope right where the road led into a forest. I would have liked to bag the fellow, so I spoke to the boss about it. Surely anything would be better than to keep waiting. So, in the end, it was decided to deploy 2 groups of riflemen and my 2 groups on the right and left side of the road against the one armored car. I was to dismount to first ascertain the Russians' precise location. This I did, and then started to wander around with the riflemen. Through the rain-soaked terrain, I then worked my way up the forest and then through it before reaching the road. While doing so, I could hear that down in Villani, the vanguard had started to move again, which resulted in an enormous amount of noise, which seemed to have frightened away the Russian on the road, who had long disappeared when we arrived there. We now stood there, soaking wet, and left with nothing. The only little success the platoon could report was the anti-tank gun that had been destroyed by Feldwebel Giersig. That was all. We had just mounted up again to rejoin our company when Feldwebel Wichler reported to me that there was something wrong with his vehicle. Again, the gearbox had ceased to work. Admittedly, our overloaded buckets had had to accomplish an awful lot in recent weeks. With his vehicle, Schirmer pulled him to the road. After he had done so, he was to catch up with us. When the company rumbled past, we attached ourselves to it and then had to halt inside the forest. Suddenly, crashing and whistling sounds, but no way to tell from where the shooting was coming. Just next to me, several branches were ripped off the trees. I quickly ducked back into the turret, as I believed that there were enemy riflemen around. In the meantime, Unteroffizier Schirmer reported back. At that moment, I did not know that the projectiles that were darting through the fir trees had fatally wounded Feldwebel Wichler. It had happened just after Schirmer had left him to drive the few hundred meters through the forest to my position. Wichler had been standing in front of the tank, giving instructions or something like that, when one of the projectiles, of all things, hit him. It pierced his body from the left to the right hip, the poor fellow. He had always been at the front with his ammunition carrier, and now had been supposed to earn his assault badge with me and my lot. How unfortunate. He was a good soldier. Through this forest we then advanced further towards the village at the top of the hill. Suddenly, things ahead got hot. The riflemen dismounted and we overtook them and advanced on the village in which Lieutenant Langenbruch was engaged in combat. Over the wireless we heard that there were several enemy vehicles ahead and how Langenbruch, with his calm voice, allocated targets to his platoon commanders. 4 enemy tanks were standing there with an infantry gun further towards the entrance to the village. Suddenly, however, an anti-tank gun started firing on us from somewhere. The boss abruptly reversed, forcing me, standing right behind him, to offer fire support, to do the same to avoid being rammed. We stopped behind a burning house, which was lucky for us, as the brothers manning what actually seemed to be another infantry gun could not see us behind it. Ahead of the riflemen, we then advanced further along the right side of our road of advance. The fire on the right of us ceased. The enemy seemed to be retreating. In front of a railway line and a swamp, we could look further down the road. On my side, on the right, I could only see forest, shrubs and a homestead in which I could see a few muzzle flashes. I opened fire on them and it became quiet. I also briefly fired upon some riflemen 1 kilometer ahead on my right, but other than that, there were no targets for me and I generally don't open fire just to steady the nerves. I've already experienced running out of ammunition once, at Davgedi, where the remaining high explosive shells I had left failed to make any impression on the enemy tanks. Over the radio, Feldwebel Wünsche continually passes on a stream of reports on enemy riflemen heading towards the bridge with explosive charges. It was also he who spotted and destroyed the Russian armored car, which had already been spotted and very much destroyed by Langenbruch. I don't like people like that. A bit of machine gun fire was exchanged after the Russians had withdrawn towards the farmhouse behind the road, but I only observed. We then returned to the cluster of houses and set up a defense there. The Russians had retreated and didn't molest us anymore during the night. We slept, only disturbed by a few Russian bombers, in an old wooden barn. Usually we always sleep in our tents to avoid catching fleas and lice. One hardly ever encounters a lancer in the houses. Those hovels, with 2 rooms at the most for a family of 12, are way too dirty for our taste. In the morning, there was time for a sleep-in. We slept until 10 a.m. People are working on the vehicles, our uniforms are being cleaned, and we wash ourselves. There's not much going on, it is now nearly evening. I'm seriously angry about how the spoils have been distributed. Feldwebel like Wünsche, Bartneck, Oswald and other members of the consortium have captured whole bales of cloth and loaded them onto the prize lorry. I don't want the men to be short-changed, so I expressed my recommendation to the boss to split everything with everyone. He tells me that the Feldwebel don't agree. Such a thieving, ignoble riffraff, all serving their own interests. I'm not having that again, and the boss agrees. He is sick of it as well and orders all the spoils to be sent to Germany immediately. I am writing when suddenly the company is ordered to assemble in battle dress, quite ceremoniously in fact. And then, once we are all standing there, the old woman Moser, our commander Oberleutnant, makes a speech. About Rasenjai, a chapter is now closed, and so on. Nice of the man, I think to myself, that he wants to express his thanks to the soldiers. But then he starts rummaging around in his pocket. Lieutenant Langbruch! Theo walks over to him. Old Siebert rummages around in his trouser pocket again and then produces a small box. In the name of the Führer, you have been awarded the Iron Cross First Class. He hands the box over to Theo. And it continues with Oswald, with whom I finished off the tank, and Aures, who has been in the thick of it since France. After a Feldwebel of the 6th Company has been decorated with the EK-1, he flips the paper he is holding over and reads, Lieutenant Sander. Then he rummages around in the other trouser pocket and pulls out a little paper bag. I'm angry about all of this. Even Father Christmas brings his presents in Mother's potato sack and not in his trouser pocket. And to think that for this kind of benediction I have risked my life. Anyway, now I have visible proof that I am not a coward. Even if Krautwig also has the Iron Cross, I at least know what I got mine for. And in the evening there wasn't even anything to drink. That was quite disappointing. But I guess we can catch up on that after the war. On the same day we had to march across Auxpils towards the Russian border, where we parked our vehicles in a farmstead surrounded by an alder forest and set up our tents. In the evening, a few bombers come over and drop their eggs on Auxpils. One can hear it here, and we can see the impacts. Flames are burning high, some wooden houses probably caught fire down there. We are going to sleep. Sunday, July the 6th, 1941. At 10 a.m. someone outside the Thames is shouting my name. That makes me quite angry. I don't want to get up that early. I try to ignore the calls, but then someone begins to dismantle the tent from the outside, and we, 3 occupants, Sepansky, Tutash and I, suddenly find ourselves crawling out of the wreckage. Outside, I find Theo Langenbruch, who is waving 2 letters in front of my nose. By the way, no human being sleeps that long on a Sunday. That's right, it is a Sunday, and we have been at war for 14 days. We carefully wash ourselves. The cool water is wonderful and there's plenty of it. No problem to use 2 bucketfuls. One for soaping up and washing the body, the other for the face and for shaving. My beard doesn't need shaving yet, so I have more water to waste. Grab a fresh shirt, hang the Knight's Cross of the Unknown across my neck, put on a tie and jacket, and then have a cup of coffee. After all, it's a Sunday, and that's why I allow myself to eat a few of the biscuits we captured from the lorries on the road. A lovely Sunday morning coffee. The only thing that's missing is a newspaper. And this arrives in Tutash's mail, die Rheinisch-Westfälische. Not a lot of news in that rag. I'm writing a few letters as well. Then the boss comes up and takes us with him to bathe. There is a small stream nearby, he says, in which it is possible to swim. When we get there, they won't allow us to swim, however. A few Lancers are standing there and tell us that swimming is forbidden as the other side hasn't been cleared of the enemy. The small stream forms the border between Latvia and the old Soviet Union. No one knows what it's called, something unpronounceable. Ultimately, we did take a bath in the stream between Latvia and the Union, just like our soldiers bathed in the English Channel, and were proud of it. In the late evening, we advance on the large main road towards the north and cross the old border where a large tank is standing in the stream next to several bunkers. The Russians had started to build a strong bunker line there, but didn't manage to finish the work. Behind the border, the houses are uninhabited, there are huge marshes and forests growing on swampy ground. An injured horse and 2 cows are the only living beings we encounter in the first 10 kilometers. A few bombers fly over, are attacked by German fighters, and 2 of the 6 are shot down. We are approaching Ostrov, which lies on the Velikaya. The bridges have been captured in a surprise attack by the 1st Panzer Division. Both are now the target of Russian bombers. The whole town of Ostrov lies in ruins. Only the outer walls of a few stone buildings are still standing, as are the churches, but they are burning brightly. We are marching on. Tuesday, July the 8th, 1941. On Monday we left the forest 3 kilometers north of Ostrov and drove to Prudi, where we arrived at 2300 hours. From there we advanced to Boldino, where the 7th Company was already engaged in a fight for the bridge on the main road. We are to repel a flanking attack by heavy Russian tanks. There is a strange mood. All is very quiet. Someone should make a really obscene joke to conjure a smile onto the faces. Everyone has become very serious. Now the Russians are shooting at us. At first we were standing on point 68 together with the boss, and the Russians sent over some shells. We had to run to find cover between the tanks. One can always die a hero's death out here, but to be killed in that manner, that can be avoided. My tank, number 523, has broken down and I have to switch over into Giersig's tank. Unteroffizier Schirmer and Feldwebel Giersig drew lots to see who had to leave the crew. By then, the fireworks had started behind us. Our own artillery had started hammering away, an infernal crescendo of sound. We draw lunch and coffee, and I warn my men to be careful. I noticed a certain recklessness recently, which I don't like. A tank drives up from the left. A man walks ahead of it, marshalling it across the terrain. It is driving very slowly. Men are gathering to see what's going on. The tank stops, and the short guy who had been walking in front turns toward us. "Where's the baggage train of the 7th Company?" I don't know the answer to this, but I ask him what's going on. The man looks at me. "We have the body of Lieutenant Kleinjung on the bow of the tank." That reply nearly knocks me over. Should I start to cry? Should I begin to swear and scream? I feel sick and walk over to the tank. And there lies Kleinjung right under the machine gun. He was shot in the head after having left his vehicle. The poor fellow. He received his Iron Cross on the same day on which I got mine. There is still some life in his gurgling lungs. I will make the Russians pay for this. I walk over to the boss to inform him about it. Oberleutnant Leonhard also came up to look at Kleinjung. I call for a medic and an ambulance. Our medic Meyer places Kleinjung on a blanket and bandages his head, from which a thick mass, the brain, is oozing. There will be payback time soon. A messenger comes running. Russians are expected to attack with several of their giant tanks. Feige with his 1st Company is in front, and he is asking for reinforcements. Everyone is tense, and in that very moment the boss makes a silly remark and we all break out into laughter. The mood immediately changes. We move out with Kübelwagen and motorbikes. About 500 meters in front of the stream, which the Russians don't want us to cross, behind a hill, there is the command post of our marching group. Shells and bullets whistle overhead, but it is relatively safe there. There is a shot-up Russian anti-tank gun made by Rheinmetall. The artillery observers, the adjutant's tank, and several signal vehicles are standing around. We take a good look at the area and start marshalling the arriving vehicles into position. My platoon is held in reserve again. Ahead, 7th Company is still fighting. We are supposed to stop the Russian armor if they manage to break through our first line. 7th Company sends a report of its vehicle inventory. 2 vehicles lost to enemy fire, 4 lost due to terrain difficulties. They still have 6 working Skodas and 2 Panzer IVs. Willy Lopez' tank got shut up too. He and his entire crew managed to bail out, however. But no one knows what happened to them yet. The ambulance is called forward. There are casualties. Medics rush to the front, message by radio. Artillery is firing on withdrawing enemy tanks and infantry. Another radio message. One of our infantry platoons has managed to establish a bridgehead on the other side of the stream, but there are casualties and they require a medic as well. That's today's job done, I guess. Gosh, 2 red fighters, Ratas, just flew over. They were about 1,000 meters up and everyone ignored the 2. But only minutes later, out of the blue, they were back, racing towards us on a very low level. I am sitting in the shadow of my tank, writing my diary when their machine guns start firing and the bullets are hammering into the road. Everyone who can pull a trigger is now firing at the 2 fighters who managed to get away unharmed. The fire on the other side has become a lot weaker. It is now 18:30 and only single shots can be heard from several kilometers away, and now and then a single mortar shell falls nearby. Work continues tomorrow. The 7th Company has been badly mauled. As well as Kleinjung, the 2nd officer has been killed. Feldwebel Meyer, who had quickly married the sister of the landlady Frau Schilling in Freistadt before we left, was killed yesterday. The company's medical Unteroffizier was killed yesterday evening at the station in Prudi. The riflemen had a lot more casualties. The quad flag unit has had 1 man killed, several wounded. Several men of the artillery were killed too. Tough day, but our 5th Company has had worse. Tomorrow we'll probably see action again. Ahead of us we appear to be facing the last stronger enemy forces in front of Petersburg. Yesterday evening, an unusually large group of 80 prisoners marched past us, mostly fresh recruit, it appeared. 7th Company and a rifleman had caught them at the station in Prudi, where they had just arrived. Prudi was one big signal again. We are here. The flames of the burning Prudi could be seen from kilometers away. There was a church on a hill between the wooden houses which were going up in flames one by one. Then the flames sprang over to the church. Tragic, as the kolkhoz farmers always used the churches as grain stores. We can always use grain as well as meat. Along one road there were counted over 20 dead cows. The farmers in the area had driven all their cattle away to make sure they wouldn't fall into our hands. We have enough to eat, so that doesn't matter too much. Soviet Russians live damn miserable lives. Today I went inside a house of one of those collective farmers. There is no way to get rid of the stink one finds in these one-room shacks, not even with hours of ventilation. A few roofed stairs lead into the living quarter. The panier himself lives in the bel étage, while all his livestock lives in the souterrain. The Podokudo and other jungle tribes live in the same way. The conditions in the one and true fatherland of farmers and workers are even more dirty and degenerate than those in Lithuania. The cattle serve as auxiliary heating in the case the enormous oven doesn't suffice. The roosts for the members of the multi-headed family are usually behind that very oven. We finally found all the cattle here near Boldino, which is how far the paniers got. A Russian shell had exploded amid the herd, but none of the cattle had been harmed. The Russian shells are far less effective than ours, but their tanks are superior and they also have very good snipers. Friday, July the 11th, 1941. When I had filled the last diary page on Hill 98 and then climbed into the tank for the attack, I did not know what experiences would lie ahead of me. It is probably a good thing that I can't look into the future, as there must be no deviation. Forward, forward and again, forward. Our destiny is forged by us, not the other way around. It was at about 1700 hours when our field kitchens brought hot bean soup just before the launch of the next attack. I spoon up a few mouthfuls and then climb into the tank. Ready for battle, radio check, and off we go. In a column of 5 vehicles we set off from the station at Karamishevo. Feldwebel Opitz and Unteroffizier Riedel of the 4th platoon had been transferred to me. As it turns out, my 3 wireless operators have disappeared. It's a bloody disgrace. We are to launch a joint attack with our riflemen, and all 3 wireless operators of my old platoon have fucked off. I'm foaming with rage. The men must have gone out foraging, and not a single prick has seen it necessary to give me notice of that. Now I have to leave without them. We are the reserve platoon and roll down the road from Karamishevo. On the left and right of that road our 5th, 6th and 7th company attacked earlier. Our reconnaissance had reported enemy entrenching activity on the hill near the village of Pikalika and along the houses on the same level along the street. They are the same troops who had been kicked out of Karamishevo earlier. I stood next to the foxholes they left in a hurry about 2 hours ago. When our riflemen approached, a whole lot of Russians had approached them, waving leaflets dropped by us in which the German government guaranteed to treat well all soldiers of the Red Army willing to surrender. I had personally interrogated 3 of them as well as I could. They told me they were members of a rifle regiment. The Germans had done a lot of shooting which had caused their regiment to disperse. Their commander had run away. One of them, speaking a mixture of Russian and Yiddish, told me that they had had 40 tanks to support them, but they had all Läufer weg, which means they ran away. Tanks with wheels, not with tracks, he explained. I suppose we are going to run into those soon. Anyway, we are following up as a reserve platoon. One of Leonhard's Panzer IVs is standing in front of some bushes in which several Russians are hiding. Our riflemen spotted the danger first, but at that moment the wretches had already gunned 2 of them down. Feige is angry. He shouts and rages and orders his men to get off our tanks. Maybe he's finally understood that the terrain has always to be thoroughly searched. But what do the other riflemen say? This isn't our job. Well, that's why they are now missing 2 of their riflemen. But who cares? The war goes on. From there, the attack continued from the village ahead of us along the road leading from Pskov towards the west. Russian infantry tries to stop us. A few rounds of 7.5 cm and some machine gun bursts, and the brothers go running. But one has to be careful, very careful, as there is always the probability that they have hidden one of the AT guns somewhere. We work ourselves closer towards the road and the Russians have run away again. Yet some of them have hidden themselves in the bushes and tall grass, and when we turn to the right, the brothers open fire on our Panzer IV, which is full, what a surprise, of riflemen who clambered on it as soon as they thought the fighting had ended. A few hand grenades silenced these Russians. Our objective of the day is Yamkino, and I am trying to reach it at all costs. We are racing on, and for a while there is nothing to see until I notice a large number of hoofprints on the road. Cavalry must have been here. What a shame, they would have made an excellent target for our machine guns. Shortly afterwards, the leader of the advanced detachment of riflemen, a few vehicles ahead of us, reports that there are about 20 Russians further ahead alongside the road. He tells us to switch our engines off so that the riflemen can lay an ambush for them. But no one is coming. The brothers must have escaped elsewhere. Along the road, we drive past growing piles of Russian weapons, ammunition and uniforms. By then, we are all infected with the fever of the hunt. Bethke radios in to tell me to hurry up, and the leader of the vanguard of the riflemen sends a messenger relaying the message that I should speed to 30 to 35 kilometers per hour. But that is out of the question. 20 kilometers per hour is just right. It allows us to see everything, the engine doesn't overheat from going too slow, and it doesn't overstrain the steering brakes. We are making good progress, and suddenly we run into German troops alongside the road. They are the vanguard of our Kratzschützen, who advanced on a path parallel to ours, together with the recon detachment. They chased the Russian rearguard into the next village, but were too few to give chase. We, however, continue to chase the brothers. In the next village there is chaos. The Russians had to abandon all their artillery there because the road had turned into a terribly sandy path. There is no way that this road, which is marked red on the maps, could be made any worse. But we continue through the sand and dust. My eyes are burning and I can hardly see a thing. And then, suddenly, a German soldier ahead of us, Unteroffizier Willi Meyer of the 1st Company of Kratzschützenregiment 6, is standing on the roadside and busies himself gathering loot from some abandoned vehicles. I immediately recognized him because of his glasses. I open the turret hatch and shout and wave to him. I don't know if he recognizes me. I button up again. Soon after, there is a horse cart in front of me. A civilian, Pani Ruski, who is also out to loot and to pick up some abandoned horses. A third horse is already tied to the back of his cart. I speed up to get closer, and he suddenly turns his head, staring at me with frightened eyes. Probably didn't expect that the engine hammering behind him would be German. We drive past modern cars, smeared with mud for camouflage, toppled over carts and limbers, exhausted horses and abandoned guns. If only we could cash all that stuff in for prize money. And finally, in the distance, trails of dust rise up, leading into the woods on the right. That's them. We are without our riflemen, but now that doesn't matter. I am just reporting the target to the boss when suddenly there's a flash in front and a shell swishes past us. 100 meters in front, I identify an anti-tank gun. I fire an explosive round, which flies apart on the outside of the gun shield with a bang. I ignore the gun and open fire into the dust trails in front, from where it flashes up again and again. By now, the Russians have disappeared into the woods. Another flash in front, and I finally realize that they are all firing at me. I am standing about 500 meters in front of my platoon. Hence, Panzer IV hadn't advanced any further. Thus, I reversed 100 meters and then asked the boss what's happening. I am tasked to take my platoon closer to the forest and then to continue the advance once the riflemen have caught up. They arrive only moments later. We are surrounded by about 200 small and large pigs, which the Russians couldn't take with them anymore. We come through several small villages and then into a swampy forest. One platoon of riflemen is far ahead when it is suddenly taken under fire. Tanks! At the side of a copse of trees near a farmstead, there is a Soviet tank which is firing on us. We are ordered to halt our tanks and to switch off the engines. A 5 cm pack is ordered forward to do the job. I sneak forward with it to observe closely what's happening. With 8 men, we manage to push the anti-tank gun into a position about 200 meters away from the tank, which we identify as a Christie. In the darkness, this isn't easy to identify. It is standing there with its engine running, and we can see the shadows of people running around it. I coordinate an attack plan with the commander of the AT gun. He will wait 20 minutes before he fires. During that time, I will head back to assemble my tanks and the Panzer IV. As soon as the AT gun has fired the first shot, we'll fire up the engines and will charge down the road. A few bursts of fire into the houses on the left and right, and then we continue towards Yamkino, our objective, which, according to our commander, Oberleutnant von Seckendorf, lies only 2 kilometers ahead of us. How wrong the judgment of a person suffering from Kreuzschmerzen and the urge to win the prestigious victory can be. It was more than twice the distance. When the shot barks out, we charge forward at full speed across a road lined with burning houses. I am in third place. Opitz in his Skoda and the Panzer IV are ahead of me. At breakneck speed we race through the sparks and heat. Flames are rising high into the dark night sky and are illuminating the whole area. And that is lucky for us because suddenly on the side of the road is an armored car. I fire around without optics, without stopping, and bang, right on target. I am so close that some small splinters fly into my face. I have no time to think about it, however, as only seconds later the blood freezes in my veins. 100 meters ahead there is an enormous Russian tank which is traversing its 7.6 centimeter gun towards me. Opitz has already raced past it. The Panzer IV drives by on its right side and fires around into it. No effect. Now I fire on it too, and suddenly I can see a blue light flashing up on the Russian tank. For a brief moment I think that the 3.7 went through, but then the flames die down and the buggers continue to traverse their gun towards me. I shout at Stepansky to take us off the road into the field on the left, but he fails to understand quickly enough. The steering brakes don't work that well either. I scream and I shout, and finally Stepansky manages to pull the tank off the road across a meadow towards some undergrowth ahead. There is movement there, so I open fire on it and send a group of soldiers running. Thank God that the vehicles behind me have also pulled into the meadow and that the Russian giant is unable to see us in the dark. My gun doesn't eject the shell casing, so I can't fire anymore. Then I notice that the huge Russian tank is rolling backwards. It is in fact slowly rolling towards us, but has its turret traversed to the rear. Hand grenades! Tutash hands me the last 3. I shove them into one trouser pocket and pistol into the other one before I exit the tank. Outside there are 2 Russians wearing steel helmets. The 2 approach me. I hasten towards one of them, rip the rifle out of his hands and wave my unloaded pistol under his nose. The other guy jumps away to the side and disappears behind a gun limber into the woods. I take the belt off my Russian and with a kick into his backside I push him towards the route of advance for prisoners of war. With his hands raised he starts jogging down a roadside ditch. The big Russian tank is now going backwards at full steam and will soon be where we are. We race to fetch a petrol can from our tank and remove its lid just in time to throw it on the 52-ton beast as it's rolling past. I try to keep up with it as it doesn't stop, but at this moment I don't give a shit about anything anymore. There is an open petrol can on its engine deck and the contents are leaking out, but it's not emptying fast enough. Damn it to hell, I can't keep up running next to it. In front of me there are Russians. I wish I had an axe with me. Instead, I lob a hand grenade on its back near to where the intake covers are. From our side, they are now also firing on the tank. I throw myself in the dirt, the grenades burst, but the petrol doesn't ignite. It must all have run into the engine. What a bad luck. At this point, I am foaming with anger. Opet's Skoda tank is standing right on the road which the Russian is now approaching, and seconds later, with a loud crash, the giant slams into the little Skoda and, with a breaking and grating sound, pushes it off the road into a ditch. For about a minute, the Russian keeps standing right next to the Skoda and flames start flickering through its engine deck. I am delighted that my petrol can seems to have worked after all. The tank is still standing and I am still prone in the dirt. At this moment, Van Dyck is coming towards me, supporting the wounded Unteroffizier Schmidt, who asks me to call an ambulance as without one he'd soon bleed to death. I am about to take a look at his wounds when suddenly I hear the engine of the Russian tank blubbering to life. Van Dyck has to take care of his wounds, I can't help him now. Together with Massense and Aures, we walk towards the tank, but it drives further down the road when we get near. It is too fast to keep up with, so we return to Schmidt, who has got a big hole in his chest. His right arm is hanging down limply and there is a deep wound in his right shoulder and a few shell splinters stick out the flesh next to it. He is still demanding that we get him the ambulance, but there is no way we can do so anytime soon. He was later picked up by one of Van Esebeck's staff cars. Massense and I fetch another petrol can and start walking. The Russian can't have gotten far. Lieutenant Ritken and a few of his men have joined us and are walking down the other side of the road. My own tank is still intact and my men in position, so there is nothing stopping me walking off. The burning houses are still illuminating the area and there is a possibility that the Russian can spot our shadows against the flames. We continue approaching the Colossus through the undergrowth. Always forward and never falter. In general, the Russians are more afraid of us than we are of them. Always forward. By then, it was past midnight and it is now Thursday, July the 10th, 1941. On the horizon, we can already see a thin red line of dawn. After Massense and Aures, it is now my turn to carry the petrol can. To catch the tank from the side, we walk through a field of rye. We walk and then we walk some more. We fail to catch the brother in front of the bridge leading over the swampy ditch. As such, we continue walking. Rittgen, Walter Leckenbusch and Obergefreiter Gustav Klein are walking on the other side of the road. And so, we continue for about 4 more kilometers through fields of grain, gardens and across swampy meadows. A half-finished anti-tank ditch can't stop us. The fuel can is getting very heavy by now. Feldwebel Jürgensmeyer on the staff, who volunteered to join us, takes it off me. Whenever we catch sight of the tank, however, it drives further away from us. We are delighted when all of a sudden a half-track comes down the road. It is towing the 5 cm anti-tank gun which we had put to good use at the farmstead. The tank is standing about 250 meters further down the road, so the crew unlimber their gun and fire a AP shell with tungsten core on the tank. The hit sends part of its suspension flying into the air, but it is still not finished. The crew plays a few smoke grenades and the tank resumes its drive up the road. We limber up again and climb into the half-track. We by now have chased the giant through 4 villages and the sun is coming up. We have to give up and I have to return to my men and see how they are doing. At least Yamkino has been reached, which makes me feel slightly better about all that walking. Finally, my tank pulls up in Yamkino. I stop it and climb on board. I have to hurry to get into the turret as at this moment Russian artillery starts thundering into the village. A few houses have already caught fire and in front one of our tanks suddenly bursts into flames. The heavy shells slam into the buildings one after another. In less than half a minute, more than half of them have started burning. We are maneuvering our tank into cover in a garden behind a house when some of our Gradschützen come racing down the road towards our side. We inquire on what's going on and are told that not far ahead, 3 of those 15 cm gun-armed 52-ton shithouses are raking the area with gunfire. Our tanks have pulled off into a field to the right and drive down there to get instructions from the boss. Oberleutnant Zangenmeister and 2 Panzer IVs are standing behind a barn. He looks completely worn out and has no clue what is going on. I spot Theo Langenbruch nearby and walk over to talk to him. I can see in his face that something nasty must have happened. He's looking very serious and the shooting alone would not shake Theo that much. And then he tells me that the boss has been wounded and taken to the rear. His loader Lange was wounded as well. 1 tank of our platoon had been destroyed, its commander was killed. Shells are crashing down all around. We decide to pull our tanks further towards a row of scrub and to camouflage them there before the sun comes up. I tell Tutash to secure the area towards the road. Zangenmeister, however, is the most senior and it should be him to take control here. But he is still standing next to his Panzer IV and is smoking one weed after the other. He seems to be thoroughly shaken. The men are standing cluelessly around him. A few guys from the flag, also not the bravest specimens of their kind, which in general is really good, are with them. One of their guns, still on its limber, is burning behind them. Slowly but surely we are learning more about the situation. The Oberstleutnants Siebert and von Seckendorf have arrived safely at the rear. There had been some super heavy Russians in front of us who, with their shooting, had set fire to pretty much everything. Our 10.5 cm battery is unable to fire as it is under the most heavy fire itself. With my naked eyes, I can see the wrecks of several of our vehicles in the area where we briefly halted earlier in the night. We were lucky indeed. Shells are coming now down left, right and center. The range is about 1,500 meters, so as soon as one spots the muzzle flash, one has to hit the turf as the projectile will hit less than a second later. I can count 3 spots from which they are firing, so these must be the 3 howitzer-armed 52-ton tanks. It's a nasty feeling to lie opposite these beasts. The adjutant makes a sudden appearance and hands leadership of the company to Langenbruch, while Böttcher and I stay in command of our platoons. We can be glad that Theo and not Böttcher has taken over. Böttcher is a proper firebrand and regularly gets on the bad side of his men. Just now, someone has asked for him, but he is nowhere to be found. He has made himself scarce. I go and look for my tank. We are all terribly thirsty. Between 2 of the barns there is a well, thank God. Our new Unterarzt and the Sanitätsfeldwebel are using the huge wooden lever to pump up water, which they intend to filter with the tornister water filter. I shout at them to find another well, as this one can be observed by the enemy, but they ignore me. I haven't walked 100 meters when there is a sharp detonation. I throw myself to the ground, and at the same time, bits of barn roofing are raining down. A second later, I haven't even managed to stand up again. A second shell hits the other barn and sets it alight. With satisfaction, I notice that the assembled medical ranks at the well have taken the hint and have hurried away from the scene. It is about 0300 when I see the 2 Panzer IVs of Oberleutnant Sangenmeister moving out of their firing positions where they had been placed to give fire support to our Skodas and a 2 cm flag. I've never seen anything like it. We have to hold this position at all costs, and Sangenmeister doesn't appear to feel responsible for that. Now, the 2 Panzer IVs are standing behind another barn about 15 meters away. A heavy shell crashes through the roof and wall, and the resulting explosion damages the suspension system of one of the Panzer IVs. At this moment, Sangenmeister shouts over that he is pulling away to the rear. Theo gives a fitting reply of a kind I can't reproduce here. After all, I am younger than he is. Theo is angry and exclaims that he will never call him Oberleutnant again, and from this point on, he will just call him Herr Zangenmeister. The manner in which I am describing Charlie's behavior here might sound funny and probably not half as bad as it actually was, but he was the oldest among us, and according to Prussian custom, he should have assumed leadership and responsibility for all of our forces there. He would just have had to take any decision, even if it had been a full withdrawal. I could have taken the responsibility for that. After all, enemy fire was heavy enough. But instead, he moved his own vehicle out of the line of fire after only 2 enemy shells, which hadn't even been fired directly at him. That is not what a Prussian, a German officer, does. He withdrew his remaining men and the one working tank he still had towards the edge of the rear of the village. We warned him that his movement would draw enemy fire on all of us, but he didn't listen and reversed about 200 meters to the rear. We are still on our bellies in the dirt. Behind us is the tank of Oberleutnant Berger. His 3 men are lying in cover behind it. He himself was only visible for a few moments when the firing started, and now he has disappeared without a trace. I stopped trying to find out where he had gone. Theo, however, in his direct manner, states that he must have run away. The Oberarzt ducks down low and makes his way towards the tank, standing more towards the middle. To be honest, I wouldn't have thought the small fellow to be that courageous. That deserves respect, and he'll be a useful guy to be with out here. Just for context, the Oberarzt is a commissioned medical officer rank equal to Oberleutnant. I am so thirsty that it hurts, even though I have started licking the morning dew off the grass and plants nearby, but then I discover a bit of peppermint candy which has been hiding in my pocket. It's one of those little sticks the Latvians make. How wonderful. It is the edge of my thirst. I break it in 2 and hand half to it to Theo, who by now is the only one still lying next to me. In such moments, little things like that are the greatest treasure. The Russians are still spitting into the village, even more so after Zangenmeister in his tank took to its heels. Sadly enough, its shells fall short and much too close to where we are lying. Another flash on the other side. Wham! The shell detonates nearby. Theo and I look at one another. Fucking shit, that was way too close. It is raining clumps of soil and dirt, half burying our asses. All this just because of Charlie. Why the hell couldn't he have stayed in cover? And again, bang, wham! A pillar of dirt rises up in front of us, and iron splinters are howling over us. That was much closer still. And now comes a horrible minute, as we both expect the next round to be on target. In such moments, a human being learns to pray, even if it has never prayed before. What little worms we are, watched over from above. He has got us in his hand. And if it gets you, that is destiny. That is why one has to stay calm, and fortune is with those who dare and who challenge destiny. Wham! The next one lands 50 meters behind us. We look at one another again, and both can't help laughing. That would have been a nice funeral, Theo says. It is now 0600, and at 10 there is supposed to be a commander's briefing. And the Russians might have already attacked by then. Here, it's only Theo and I and a Feldwebel and a handful of men from the 6th who are not scared of the big Russian shithouses. In the worst case, we have to do it the old way, with petrol cans and hand grenades. The Russian infantry is not particularly good. We can deal with them, if they'll ever come. They did not, however. At 0830, the fire has died down, and we receive the order to take our tanks over the open field ahead. So, either we'd get badly roughed up by the Russians, or we'd find that they had disappeared. And they had disappeared. We and the still living members of our company report back to Oberst Koll, and I can't help grinning when I see the immaculately turned out headmaster behind his desk. We were standing there with mud-covered, soaked uniforms, dirty, unshaven faces, torn uniforms. In Theo's case, with a triangular tear which offered an excellent view of his underpants. The immaculately turned out general, who had been in this case far enough in front to be able at least to hear the guns, is looking chastisingly over his thin spectacle frames as we dirty bastards rush in to disturb him during his briefing. Right, in this episode we experienced the duality of the war at the time. On the one hand, our author takes a swim as if it was peacetime, while simultaneously commenting about the quality of Russian snipers, and just a few days later he experiences his first major battle with a handful of casualties. It will all be downhill from here, I guess. Another interesting thing is the fact that he and some others went after a single Russian tank on their own, on foot, carrying a fuel canister for miles. This is absolutely ridiculous and a bulletproof way to get killed and or captured. It is especially crazy when he himself, only a few minutes before, complains about one of his commanders shooting for a Knight's Cross and being reckless in the process. Well, anyway, this is it for this episode. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Cheers.